All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're going to explore two of the most powerful critiques of our modern world. We're putting two really profound thinkers, René Guénon and Taha Abdurrahman, into a kind of philosophical dialogue. Why? Because we want to understand the spiritual and ethical crisis they both saw hiding right at the center of our modern age. So let's get into it.
So here's our game plan for this little seminar. We're going to start by really nailing down what this crisis of modernity even is. Then we'll unpack how Guénon and Taha diagnose the problem, each from their own unique angle. After that, we'll see where their ideas actually converge in this really powerful way, where they split apart on the solutions, and finally, what we can learn from putting them in conversation with each other today. Okay, so what is the central problem we're wrestling with here? I mean, modernity is built on this grand story, right? A story of nonstop progress, of enlightenment, of more and more freedom. But both of our thinkers look at this story and ask a pretty radical question. What if all this so-called progress is just a mask, hiding a much, much deeper kind of loss? This quote just gets right to the bone of the critique, doesn't it? The idea that in our mad dash for progress, we've actually lost something absolutely essential. To figure out what that something is, we turn to our two guides, the French metaphysician René Guénon and the Moroccan philosopher Taha Abdurrahman. And what's so fascinating is that even though they come from totally different worlds, they end up with a diagnosis that is startlingly similar. First up is René Guénon. Now, for him, the crisis of modernity isn't fundamentally about politics or economics or technology. No, it's way deeper than that. For Guénon, it's a metaphysical crisis. He argues that our entire civilization has basically unplugged itself from the fundamental principles of reality. This right here is the absolute key to understanding Guénon. He makes this crucial distinction between the higher intellect, which is our ability to directly, intuitively know universal truth, and the lower reason, which is the part of our mind that just analyzes and categorizes the material world. And according to Guénon, modernity's single biggest mistake was to put reason on a throne and completely forget the intellect even exists. And that brings us to his very specific use of the word tradition. Now, when Guénon says tradition, he does not mean quaint customs or holiday recipes. For him, tradition, with a capital T, is the living, breathing, unbroken chain that transmits that deep metaphysical knowledge, the stuff grasped by the intellect. And it is this very chain, he says, that modernity has shattered. So what happens when you lose the intellect? Well, you lose the ability to see quality, to see essence, to see the sacred in things. All you're left with is what you can measure, what you can count, what you can weigh. This is what Guénon famously called the reign of quantity, a world where everything, from a forest to a human life, is reduced to its material, quantifiable value. Naturally, this crisis spills over into our ethics. I mean, in a world of pure quantity, what happens to morality? Guénon says it collapses into something he calls moralism, basically a fake ethics, just an ethical veneer. We still use words like good and bad, but it's just talk, a kind of shifting opinion used to justify whatever we want, because the transcendent foundations that made those words mean something are long gone. Okay, let's pivot now to our second thinker, Taha Abdurrahman. He arrives at the same feeling of modern emptiness, but he takes a completely different road to get there. He doesn't start with metaphysics up in the clouds, he starts right here on the ground, with ethics and the very nature of what it means to be human. Taha's entire philosophy really hinges on this one powerful concept, itsimania, or trusteeship. He argues that the whole modern idea of the free, autonomous individual has it completely backward. Before we are anything else, he says, we are trustees, an amin, defined by a sacred trust, a deep responsibility to God, to each other, and to the world itself. Our very existence is relational and responsible. And the core sickness of modernity? Taha gives it a name, faṣl. It means severing or disconnection. He says modernity just severs everything from everything else. It cuts reason away from ethics, leaving us with a cold, purely instrumental logic. It severs our words from any real moral weight. It cuts knowledge off from the responsibility that ought to come with it. Taha even maps out how this severing affects how we think. He identifies 3 kinds of reason. Modernity celebrates what he calls denuded reason. It's abstract, technical, and stripped of any values. He says that's actually the lowest form. A step up is guided reason, which at least tries to follow moral laws. But the highest form for him is supported reason, which isn't just following rules, but has been totally transformed from the inside out by deep ethical and spiritual practice. So we've got Guénon's metaphysical critique on one side and Taha's ethical one on the other. And even though they start in completely different places, they end up pointing to the very same devastating wound at the heart of the modern world. This slide really brings it all together. This is the core synthesis. What they're both describing is a double rupture. Guénon identifies the vertical rupture, humanity cutting its connection to the transcendent, to the sacred order above us. This is what leads to that reign of quantity. And at the exact same time, Taha identifies the horizontal rupture, human beings cutting their connections to each other, to their ethical responsibilities around them. This is what leads to that state of faṣl, of total disconnection. It's a crisis in two dimensions at once. Okay, so if they agree so deeply on what the problem is, then what's the solution? Well, this is where their paths just split wide open. How in the world do you go about healing a double rupture like this? And this table just lays out the stark difference. Guénon's path is one of metaphysical withdrawal. For him, the modern world is basically a lost cause. The answer is for a small spiritual elite to find a real tradition, undergo initiation, and preserve timeless truth, essentially waiting for this dark age to end. Taha's response is the polar opposite, full-on, active, ethical engagement. He calls for a deep renewal of tradition from within, through ethical practices that everyone in the community can take part in. So we're left with these two very different prescriptions. But the real value here isn't about picking a winner. It's about seeing what their dialogue, this very tension between their views, tells us about our own situation. When you get right down to it, maybe we need both perspectives. Guénon provides that incredible metaphysical depth. He gives us the why. He shows us why this crisis is so profound that a simple political fix will never work. But then Taha comes in and offers a practical path forward. He gives us the how, a way to actually start the work of repair through concrete ethical action in the world. Put them together and you get a much, much more complete map of where we are. And all of this leaves us with one last, really big question to chew on. If the crisis of our time truly is this double rupture, if we're cut off both vertically and horizontally, can we really expect to heal by just choosing one path? Or does any true, lasting response have to somehow heal both ruptures at the same time? To reconnect with something transcendent, while also recommitting fully to our ethical responsibilities to each other right here and right now.